All right. So, Niam, feel free to take it away. We're happy to learn a little bit about your job market paper today.
So good morning, everybody. This is morning time in Oklahoma, and I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much, Brian, for the opportunity. So today I'm very excited to talk about place-based policies in Vietnam. So the question that I want to think about is how should governments around the world address spatial inequality? Why spatial inequality? Because large and persistent regional differences can actually threaten social stability. And we've seen everywhere that spatial inequality is large and persistent. And so, two common policies that governments around the world have been thinking about and considered are trying to move firms into disadvantaged regions and creating jobs there, or facilitating mobility for people to move out of these regions and to come to places where jobs are. But in practice, we see that many countries implement both approaches um, in some perhaps uncoordinated way. So in the US, for example, we see that the US spend around $2 billion a year on opportunity zones, which is a program that's trying to give tax incentives for firms to move into lagging regions. And simultaneously, we also see that many of America's most thriving cities, including San Francisco and New York City, have very limited housing regulations, have very strict housing regulations that lead to very high housing prices and that limit the ability for people from lacking places to come to where jobs are. Okay? And similarly, the case of China, where they have special economic zones that aim to move firms around, but also have the hukou system. And in India, they give tax incentives for firms into backward districts, but they also have limited access for migrants to urban amenities. Okay, and so in this project, I'm going to try to ask and answer the following question, which is what are the welfare effects when both policies are implemented simultaneously? I'm going to answer this question in the context of Vietnam, where both policies were implemented at the national scale. And in that process, I'm trying to connect two literatures that have developed largely in isolation, which is the literature on place-based policy and the literature on migration policy. Okay, I'm also gonna tell you whether these policies reinforce or offset one another. This is how I'm going to think about these questions. And in this toy example of two locations, I'm going to demonstrate and illustrate to you the contribution in terms of methodology on the model of my paper. Okay, so let's consider two locations, rural and urban, one rich and one poor. Okay, and how should we think about spatial inequality or the effects of this policy on spatial inequality between these two regions? So let's zoom into one location. Let's consider the rural place. There are two types of people here. Typically, they're going to be an entrepreneurs and they're going to be workers, right? And they interact in labor market because the entrepreneurs need to hire some workers, combine that with some other inputs like land to produce some goods, and they're gonna sell these goods to the local economy as well as trade that goods to the urban area. Okay, and unlike the entrepreneurs who tend to be fixed in the local economy, the workers tend to be very mobile. They can migrate to the urban area when there are opportunities there. Um, and the entrepreneurs are not engaged in migration, but they engage in trade. Now, this setup is very common in the quantitative dynamic spatial model now. But what I'm going to add, and this is the important ingredients to think about place-based policy, are the following two ingredients. The first is that I'm going to allow the entrepreneur and the workers to change occupations. And this is what I'm going to call firm dynamics in this context. So basically, when profitability go up, the worker can switch into become entrepreneur. Whereas when migration opportunities becoming very attractive, the entrepreneurs can switch to become workers and migrate. Okay. Uh, and in addition to firm dynamics, and I'm going to tell you why this is very important for the context and for place-based policy. I'm also going to consider the provision of public services. So people, including entrepreneurs and workers, they not only consume goods, but they also consume public services like hospitals and schooling for children. And they care about the per capita consumption of public services. Why? Because if you have 10,000 schools, but you have a million people, is actually not that great, right? Um, and how can local government finance the provision of public goods? They're going to get that from profit tax. So this is very common in developing countries where governments finance they get most of their revenue from the firms and not personal income tax like the developed countries. And the local governments also interact with the central government. Okay, so the local governments gather all of these revenues. They keep some of those, but they have to send some of those back to the central government. The central government gather the whole pile and they redistribute that across space as well. Yes, Brian.
Sorry, just a quick question for context here. When you're saying local, how local should I be thinking right now? Like, should I be thinking province? Should I be thinking
Province.
country?
Yes. So the whole quantitative analysis is going to be at the province level. It's almost impossible to know what the district people do with the budgets and how much they collect and so on. So um, yes. These interactions will also complicate how the distribution of spatial inequality or spatial inequality should be. So how should we think about place-based tax incentives in this context? So essentially, uh, you know, place-based policy is trying to reduce some form of profit tax so that entrepreneurship is going to increase in the local economy, right? So you reduce tax rate, hopefully some firms stay, some firms entry, and so on and so forth. But what's the cost of that? The cost is that if you reduce tax rate so much, and there's nobody coming, no firms entry, or no firm stay, they all leave, then you actually hurt your budget, okay? And that's going to hurt your ability to provide for your people. And that, in fact, they're actually going to increase inequality if you reduce tax rate so much and there's no firm entry or firm stay. On the other hand, right, how can you think about migration policy? Let's say you're reducing migration cost for people to migrate into urban areas. When people move into urban areas, that's going to lead to perhaps more firms entering these places because of agglomeration effect. That's actually going to raise inequality across regions because the urban places now becoming even more productive and richer. On the other hand, right, the effect is actually ambiguous when you started thinking about large-scale changes in migration that could lead to congestions in both the land market, right, housing costs going to increase, as well as the congestion of public services in the urban areas. Okay, and so the effects of migration policy on spatial inequality is also ambiguous. Okay, Diane?
Just a quick question. So what is the cost sharing between the central and the local government? Let's say if I collect the tax at the local level, how much does it I had to keep? How much is it going to the central government? And if I don't make enough, like let's say I'm a poor province, how much is it the central government going to give me and so on?
Beautiful. That's a great question. I'm going to answer that in about 5 slides. And when we think about the context, it's going to be very specific. Yes, Shung Yu?
Yes, so I'm just wondering when you think about this kind of policies, I guess another issue is thinking about agglomeration. So there's a trade-off, right? You may want to increase spatial inequality if that means that you can gain in terms of agglomeration.
Yep. And so exactly, perfect. And so the outcomes of interest is actually not just spatial inequality. We also need to think about aggregate welfare. And so I'm going to present to you results of each policy, the effects of each policy in 2 dimensions. The dimension of aggregate welfare, which what you're talking about, like agglomeration and so on, and also spatial inequality. And I think policymakers should think about both. They shouldn't care about one outcome only. Okay, and this framework actually going to allow you to answer that question too. So any other questions before we move into the context? So basically, the takeaways in this toy example, we can see that this quantitative analysis is very important because the number are going to tell you how these forces going to, on net, give you the result that you want or you don't want. Okay, so we need to think about a very specific context. And so Vietnam is a great context. Why? Over the past like 2 decades, people, all of you here probably know that Vietnam have grown a lot in terms of GDP per capita, going from around 6% of the US in 2000 to around 14% of the US today. But what you probably may not pay attention to is that over the same period, spatial inequality measured by the Gini coefficient of regional GDP per capita, or what they call the GRDP, right, has declined tremendously as well, going from 0.4 to 0.25. What does it mean? It means that the top 10% of provinces in terms of GDP was 12 times as rich as the bottom 10 in 2000, and today is around only 4 times. It's still very large though. Like the ratio between Oklahoma and New York is like 2, and 4 is double that. Okay, so it's still very unequal relative to the U.S. So how do we think about spatial inequality? So basically, Brian and others, you have studied many things that can actually contribute to regional development, right? For example, how the trade shock affects poverty rates across provinces. But in this project, we're going to think about 2 policies. The first policy is the enterprise income tax reform in 2003. And here I'm actually gonna actually indebted to An here, who actually pointed out the policy change in 1999, which is actually now incorporated into this paper. So before 2003, in 1999, when they published the first, basically the firm law, they also issued this decree that established 3 categories for 630 districts in Vietnam. So if you enter one of these, the A locations, think of the A locations at the richest locations. B is like slightly less rich, and C are the poorest locations. Then, as a new firm into these places, you get a 32% tax rate on your profits if you enter the A locations. If you enter the B locations, you get a 25% tax rate throughout your life cycle, and the C locations, you're gonna pay 20% tax rate. Okay. But very soon after, in 2003, the government changed this schedule. So in 2003, they specifically lowered the profit tax for younger firms in poorer places. Okay, so if you enter the C or B locations for the first few years, you get a 0% tax rate on your profits. And then it gradually increases, but it's increasing slower for the C place relative to the B place. And after around 10 years, oh no, actually 12 years, then the 2 places tax rate would match with the rich location, the A locations. Notice that it's actually very complicated because you also see a decline in level for the A locations, right? So the A location also becomes slightly more attractive because going from 32% to down to 28%. So there's also a level effect across all locations. So I'm going to focus on the effects of this 2003 policy and trying to identify and quantify the effects of this. So one thing that you might ask is, okay, is this policy actually target poor places? Or it's just some uncles of some guys, right? In this province, in these regions. I would argue that actually, yes, this policy trying to target really poor places. So the mean poverty rate in 1999 of the C location is around 66%, like 70%. For the B is 44%, and for the A location it's only 25%. And the profit tax is actually a very important tax, right? It's account for 40% of Vietnamese government revenue in 2000, relative to personal income tax, that's only 2%. Okay, and one thing you also can be worried about is that when there's a change in this policy, what happens to the labels of this A, B, and C? I would say that they are actually quite stable. Around 82% of these districts will keep the same label over this 2 policy period. Obviously, there's some changes, and these changes actually, when I think about the quantification and estimation, I would consider only places that have the same labels, and I would disregard those that changed, because that could lead to selection, and I don't know what happened. Why is it that they changed these locations? Okay. Yes.
Actually, maybe you have already answered it, but do you happen to have the criteria in which they decide what A, B, and C are, like below certain
Yes.
poverty rate and so on?
So we don't know any official document that trying to argue why. I've been looking, right, for this, but the people who set these policies are mostly dead. So it's hard to know exactly what happened in 2000, or they retire and we cannot track them. But from just correlating these labels to observables, right, we see that it's highly correlated with the poverty rate, agricultural share, manufacturing share, and a lot of research by this guy named Minot, M-I-N-O-T, et al. It's yeah. So I think Brian knows that he has some data in terms of trying to estimate district level poverty rate. It's actually, I think the government based these labels on this poverty rate that they done in 1999. Okay, but it's not perfect. It's not 100% correlation. So I think that the goal is to target poor places, but it's not a perfect targeting. All right. And so how common is this age-dependent feature of the place-based policy? It is very common. It's around the world. India, you see that in India, you see that in France, you see that in China. The reasons, I mean, not many researchers, have done on this is perhaps we lack a model of firm dynamics. Okay. So another thing that, trying to answer these questions of quantitative analysis is that the challenge with the data. So this policy changes at the district level, right? But the migration data, the province revenue data is also only at the province level, not at the district level. So to actually get everything consistent, I have to aggregate this district place-based policy to the level of province somehow. And we're going to do that using weighted population across location. And here's the map of the A, B, and C locations at the province level. Okay, you can do some changes for this, but I feel like this aggregation seems to match with my intuition or the map to the left as to what of the places that are poor and rich. And here you also see this. I have the new category A star, and then we'll talk about that immediately. Okay. So the second policy that I consider in this project is the change in the hộ khẩu policy. So basically, when you're born in Vietnam, you're basically given a passport, the red book here in the particular province. If you want to migrate to a different province, you will have to apply for basically a temporary status or visa. It's a blue book. And as temporary migrants, you have limited access to urban public amenities, including schooling for your children and healthcare. This is basically the hukou system in China, except that it's a little bit less strict. Okay, and before the reform, it was very difficult for temporary migrants to become a permanent resident because of these two criteria. First, you have to, as a temporary migrants, you have to go back to your origins to ask for a relocation certificate. And second, if you actually get that certificate, you need to go to the destination and say, oh, I have some land or property ownership, which usually require you to have the permanent resident status to get this. So it's basically like a vicious cycle that almost impossible to break. Okay? And then after 2005, the government basically removed some of these two crazy requirements. And it's basically a reduction in migration costs everywhere in Vietnam, right, given the reform. But it also has spatial component to it, which is that if you wanted to enter one of the 5 major cities, here denoted as A star, so think of this as a subset of the A locations. So in this project, we have A star, A, B, and C. So the A star places, right, if you want to live there, you have to demonstrate residence for at least 1 year, which in practice is actually take much longer time and cost for you to demonstrate your residence in this location. So think of this as a policy that's reducing migration costs everywhere, but a little bit less so for the 5 major cities, right? Okay. Any questions so far? So then we're gonna think about the questions by Anh here, which is how do we think about, simultaneously with these 2 policies? Another policy that happens every year annually in terms of redistribution from the central government and local governments. Okay, so on this figure, I'm trying to show you on the left panel, the fraction, the share of local government budgets that they get to keep. Okay, so 100% means that the place get to keep 100, like all of their revenue, and the lower than 100% means that they don't get to keep all of it, and the rest going to the central government. And you could see here that the poor places, C, B, right, they tend to keep a lot of their revenue because perhaps they don't raise a lot of money. And whereas the A-star locations, they get to keep very little. Like here, right, think about Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi basically financing the whole country. And then once the government get the whole pile, they redistribute that back to the local economy. So that's going to be the right panel here. So this is the share of the local budget that's coming from the central government. So think about the C location, right? They make very little. Basically, they get a bunch of subsidies from the central government for their local revenue. And then vice versa. On the other hand, you have the A-star locations, right? They get very little in terms of their budget from the central government, okay? Because perhaps they're much richer. And you do see that there's changes over time, right? The poorer places becoming less and less dependent on the central government, perhaps due to decreases in spatial inequality and there's heterogeneity in terms of how this changes across the locations. So this is a very complicated system, right? I mean, this is not the interest of this paper, but this is an interest of the whole literature on nonlinear taxation and public finance. What I'm going to do is that I'm actually going to acknowledge that they exist of this policy, and I'm going to try to account for all of these changes as I'm study the tax and migration policies. Okay, so think of it as all the counterfactual that we're going to look at is allowing for all of these changes to happen simultaneously. Okay, and what we're going to be able to identify is the effect of the tax policy alone, even in the existence of these transfers that happening simultaneously. Okay. All right. So so we need to think about, when we think about quantification, we need data. Okay. So basically the model and the data that we need, we have firms, we have people, and we have trade. So we need that three components. So the firms data, we use the annual enterprise surveys, which is mandatory for all registered firms in Vietnam to report to annually. It covers all firm size, right? Not on, not just big firms report everybody. You can see the firm size distribution in the paper. And it's I'm using McCade et al. It's forthcoming in Ristad to create consistent information of firm locations, employment, and industry. For the migration data, I'm going to use the population census in 1999, 2009, and 2019. It's going to tell you migration flows for 60 provinces consistently over time. And then for trade data, we only have the cross-sectional data from Zika in 2000. It's basically digitized trade at a distant level across provinces. And that's going to help us with the model. And then finally, some other provincial level data from statistical yearbooks and other sources. So in the paper, I'm documenting 2 facts before I jump into a structural model. But this fact is just basically trying to motivate the model. So if you just do a simple event study comparing the B and C locations, right? Just disregard all the A places, including A star. You will see that the lowering the tax rate for the C location increase the number of firms and jobs. Just doing a very simple two-way fixed effects or event study and between B and C, you find that. The increase in number of firms is around 20%, number of employments also around 20-25%. And then you can also do some simple summary statistics where you can see that migration increased very much between the two population census, 99 and 2009, especially for migrants coming from the non-A-star location. Okay. If I have time later, I would love to show you this summary statistics, or as we go along, if there's any confusion, I can go back and show you. But with all of this reduced form analysis, right, it's still very difficult for you to interpret the estimates. Why? Because all of this, tax, migration, and fiscal policies all vary at the location time level. So in a way, it's very hard for you to know whether this variation is coming from which policy or it's a combination of all of them. And second, you can't really do counterfactual. It's hard for you to make a stand in terms of welfares. When you see a 20% increase in firms, does that mean that welfare increased? Or does it mean that you are losing in terms of public services? Okay. So we need a model, and that is basically summarized in the toy example that I showed you earlier. Okay, and I'm not going to try to show you much more, but I'm happy to answer any questions here.
Can I ask about the second fact? So
Yes.
just to clarify that I understand this correctly. So you are seeing with this reform, you see more migrants from non-A star places moving to A star places.
Yes, actually, yes, that's true. So actually, maybe it's best to just show the fact. Okay, So here on the left panel, this is the migration rate separating for non-A-star origins and A-star origins. Okay, so this is a fraction of people that migrate. And in the 2009 census, you see that non-A-star people migrate a lot more, and there's a big increase, okay, relative to the A-star origins. So everybody started to move because of this reform, or not because of this reform, it's correlated with this reform, okay? And then where do they go? Conditional on moving, right? The non-A-star people moving a lot more towards the A-star provinces, despite having still some additional migration costs that they have to incur, right? And they, this going from 40% to 50% of people. They're choosing to go to the A-star locations. And the group that actually don't go to the A-star places are the people already starting out in A-star places. Okay. So
So in that sense,
yes. So
so
in that
sorry,
sense,
please finish. Yeah.
Yeah, in that sense, it's actually not a very simple comparison when you just put a dummy for non-A star or A star on the right-hand side times post that you can identify things. And I would be very clear about how it's very difficult because this policy changes both in terms of level and cross-sectional, right? So like the A star places actually make it easier because they delete some of these requirements, but they're just deleting less things than the non-A star places. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, so you see non-A-star places, people move more and they are more likely to move to A-star places. So in that
Yes.
sense, this system reform kind of increase spatial inequality, right?
We'll see.
Can
We'll
I?
see. We'll see. We'll see. We just see that they move, right? We can't make a segment about welfare yet.
But if your goal is to think about spatial inequality, then people are moving into A-star places, right? So that's
It's
why I think
yeah, but
it's an
yeah,
increase in
it's
spatial
suggestive
inequality.
that it's not clear how it's gonna go, right? It's not clear how it's gonna go because maybe they're moving too much into the A-star location and it's congesting all these places, and it's actually making it worse for them, for the
It's,
people in A-star. So we'll see.
got it.
Yeah. Yes, Brian.
So just a small point about that migration summary stats. I think if you actually restricted the sample to sort of like a younger, the most mobile portion of the population, like here I'm thinking like 18 to 27, 28, the people that across almost all countries tend to be the most mobile. These
Yeah.
migration rates are going to be a lot higher. And to some extent that might help you in terms of pitching why we care about migration so much here.
Beautiful. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, this is like 18 to 65s, which is like, typically what we do. But yeah, 18 to 27, we see a huge difference. And even with male relative to female or something, that'll be even more. Okay. All right. So the model, right? So the model taught you basically two things, that we need to care about two objects from the model. The first object is what I call the elasticity of firm state with respect to changes in tax incentives. Why is it important? If no firms, there's no changes in entrepreneurship, given the changes in tax rate, it's very clear that the place rate policy is a failure. Okay, and also, as we discussed the migration thing, right? It's very important to back out the changes in migration cost. So far, we just see like dummies, like non-star, A-star, what does it mean? People move in some magnitude. But what we care about in terms of welfare is how this policy, the whole policy, transfers into migration cost measure as the utility level. Okay, so we need to estimate these two things. How do we do that? We take the model to the data. So I'm going to estimate first the firm's survival elasticity with respect to tax incentives. So let me show you a little bit of equations. So think about a firm of age A in sector J, location I at time T, okay? And how does a tax rate change for this firm age location would affect the profitability or the decision of the firms. So on the left, you have the entrepreneur value. So think about a person, right? Like an entrepreneur with age A. They would consume locally. So this is the C. They would consume what? G is the government public service, right? G divided by L, which is population, is the per capita public services. Plus, they would also consume goods. And where do they get the goods from? They would get the goods from their profits, right? So they sell some stuff and they get their profits, which is pi. And that profits will be discounted because they have to pay some tax rate tau, which is age specific, location specific, and time specific. Okay, so that's their local consumption. And then they're going to make a dynamic decision. Should I stay? If I stay, I get this value V and A prime, which is like the next age, right? So if I'm 2 years old, I become 3 years old. And with some idiosyncratic shocks, right? Maybe I just become very more productive immediately. Or I make a choice. I actually, if things are not going very well, I face of negative shocks, I would switch out and become a worker. And the U is the value function of the worker. Okay. Yes.
Can I ask why the profit tax depend on firm age?
Oh, because it's a policy. Remember this, like the policy, this step side thing, right? It's the policy change as
Depending
the age,
on
exactly
how
age, right? So
old
like
you are.
exactly. So when you enter, right, after 2003, if you are young, you get a lower tax rate, and if you're old, you get a higher, relatively higher tax rate, right? So that's how we're gonna trace out the impacts of the age dependence tax.
Got it.
Yes.
Do you allow for a reverse migration from rural back to urban?
Yes, yes, we'll see migration soon. You can move everywhere. Actually, there are 60 provinces. You can move to anything, you go back, blah, 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 blah.
But then the discount factor and the worker value, from my intuition, it should be the sum of discount factor in all the future choice, right?
No. The beta is the discount factor of the next period. Okay. Within this U, you're gonna have a max operator across all locations. So once you discount for the future, you can choose wherever you want to go. And of course, the discount factor is a time thing. It doesn't have a spatial thing. The spatial thing come from your, how attractive different locations are relative to your current locations. We'll see this U very soon. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what is important here? What important here is this parameters chi. This is the dispersion of entrepreneurability. Okay. This is an observed factor. And if this chi is very dispersed, it means that for some reasons, entrepreneurs really productive or less productive, and the profitability doesn't really matter to them. For some reason, I just like love staying in Ho Chi Minh City. There's nothing you can do to move me. Okay, even when you give me a lot of tax break, going into like Dak Lak or something, and that is gonna be pinning down our firm entry or firm stay elasticity. And so what do we think of, how do we connect the chi with data? So we're going to look at this object called the firm survival probability, which is the ratio between the value of an older firm relative to the sum of the value of being older and being a worker. So think of this like basically the probability of you staying in the local economy, right? If you notice, this object, this is basically like a very simple discrete choice model, right? If you take the ratio between this sigma thing relative to 1 minus sigma, you actually can cancel out the entire denominator, okay? And what you're left with is basically the exponential difference between the V and the U, okay? So basically when you take the ratio between the odd of stay versus exit, you can actually see the difference, the relative between attractiveness between staying versus exiting. Okay. Yes.
Oh, yes. Actually, would you mind remind me of after 2003, what was the tax rate for newly established firms? I'm asking that because I actually looking at one of my notes on the different policy, and I see that before 2003, younger firms or newly established firms also receive zero tax rate for the first 2 years, and then after that, 2 more years with 50%. Of the statute.
Yeah, so before 2003, there's no differences in terms of age. Okay.
Actually, there is. I just sent you an email. So that's why
Yeah, I read that policy many times. It's actually very hard for you to get that that's younger incentives. You need to have some sort of either firm size, or you need to have a sector specific so that you can get this benefits for younger firms. It's not that just younger gonna provide you with the tax incentives
Okay,
before
well, we can read,
2003.
yeah.
We
We
can
talk about the,
we can
we
talk
can
about
talk
it later,
about
but the
yeah.
details of the policy, and that's the way I think about the 2003. The beauty of that is that it's very transparent in terms of allowing younger firms to get the benefits relative to the 1999 version of it. Okay, I'm happy to discuss more. All right. Okay, so it's not done, right? So when you take the ratio, you get the differences in values, but inside the value function, you still have a bunch of variables about the future. And one way for you to actually deal with that is to just construct this variable that I call last. It's local age-specific turnover rate, which is taking the probability of the firms, the share of firms that stay divided by the share of firms that exit, multiplying the share of firms that exit in the next period, and this also age dependent. Okay. So basically, this is your outcome of interest. So that's going to be the outcome variable, the log of that. And on the right-hand side, you will have the changes in the tax rate. Okay, so that's going to get, the theta here is exactly the elasticity, okay, which is the log firms relative to log of tax rate. And the important fixed effects that you need to account for is location, time, and sector fixed effects. Why is that? Because when you have the changes in tax rate, it's changing all of these wages and value at the local level, even at the sector location level. And so having these fixed effects will deal with all of the changes in local amenities, local wages, and the effects of all the other policies, migration policy, government spending policy, right? Those things are going to be accounted for. And we're going to explore variation by location, age, and time. That's the dimension that we're going to explore. Okay. And so what do we get? We get something like 0.27 when you account for all of these fixed effects. And how large or how small? Well, this is not really done a lot in the literature, but I found one paper that look at differences in asset and asset rate across countries, and it's about 0.84. Okay. What does that mean, right? So like for our estimate here, a 10 percentage point reduction in tax cut will lead to about 2.2% increase in survival odds, which is not a very big number, but but it's consistent with whatever we find in literature. Now we're going to move to migration costs. Okay. Okay, so how do we identify the changes in migration cost across locations? Oh, I have 20 more minutes, right, Brian? Or how do we think about time here?
So yeah, normally we sort of present for about 45 minutes, but there's been quite a few questions. So, why don't you aim to kind of try to finish around like 11:50, and then we can have sort of 10 minutes for open Q&A.
Perfect, sounds great. Okay, let me try to move a little bit faster. So to identify changes in migration costs, we need to link migration costs to data. So the data that we look at is migration share. So mu is the migration share of people from I moving to N between period T-1 and T, divided by the share of people who stay. And on the right-hand side, you will have the migration cost, M and IN, and the differences in value function between the location N and I. Okay, so if you just do a simple, like dummy for the destinations and in the A star and some dummy for time, what you're gonna identify is not just migration cost changes, but migration cost changes and the changes in the values functions. So think about if you have 10,000 of people moving to Hanoi, right? It's not only changing because of migration costs, but it could be because Hanoi is just becoming a little bit more attractive relative to the rest of Vietnam. And you cannot identify the differences between the two when you just do like a dummy for Hanoi and comparing to the rest. Okay. And so what trick do we use to actually net out this U? We don't like this U. We just take the ratio that you just do the inverse. So this is called a Hedry index, which is you take I to N multiplying N to I, and that basically on the right hand side you only have migration costs, and that's how you're going to identify isolate the changes of migration costs and nothing to do with the U. Okay. So how do I identify? So let's just plot something. So here is the changes in the Hedry's index for the non-A star locations. So think about migration flows between places that not the top 5, okay? And when you plot a distribution, of course, there's huge heterogeneity, but on average, you find that the number is 0.66. What does it mean? So when you look at the heterogeneity index, if it's a large number, if it's a positive number, it means that the migration costs have been declined, right? Because there's a minus of 1 over nu here. So if migration cost changes is negative, then the heterogeneity should be positive, which is the case here, meaning that over the period, there's evidence that there's changes in migration cost in terms of reducing migration cost. How do we identify spatial variation? So to identify spatial variation, we're just going to put the left-hand side is the heterogeneity index, and we're going to basically do a triple differences again, where the dummies are origin A star, destination A star, relative to non-A star places, right? And we're exploring both the origin and destination pairs, not just the destination of A star. And that would help us because we're going to include both origin geofix effects and destination geofix effects to wipe out all of the local time factors, right? Like changes in tax policy and so on and so forth. Okay, so the number makes some sense. It makes a lot of sense as well, right? So basically going to the A star places is a little bit trickier, right? But it's not so bad that it's actually make it like it's not like 0 minus 0.9 or something, right? It's not ridiculous. So it makes sense. Okay, so in about 8 minutes, I will show you the results. Right, you have endure all of this. So I take some other parameters from the literature. The model doesn't have like a huge number of parameters anyway, and we're gonna do counterfactuals. All right. So what is the effects of both policies? Okay, so now I'm going to look at the counterfactual where you remove the tax and migration policies to actually isolate the effects of these policies on the number of firms, the number of workers, real wages, and public service per capita, right? There's 4 outcomes. This is allocation. This is not welfare yet. So basically what you find is that the number of firms in the B places will increase by about 22% in a steady state. The C places is a little bit less attractive. It's again about 14% in terms of number of firms. And you can see the number of firms increase everywhere because you see that the tax rate fall from 32% down to 28%. So entrepreneurship becomes more attractive everywhere in Vietnam. The number of workers is actually not that huge, right? It takes a lot of effort to move people across space. So basically in a steady state, which is in like 50 years, you only see a 4% increase in workers in the B places. It's not a huge increase in the number of workers. And because there's a massive increase in labor demand and there's not much changes in labor supply, you see real wages increase everywhere and more so in the poorer places. But the magnitude is not tremendous. It's like 2%. But what's the cost? The cost is actually quite big, right? It's the reduction in public service per capita is decline everywhere and more so in the poorest places. It's about 1% or 2% per capita. Okay, so how do we interpret this in terms of welfare? In terms of welfare, what we're going to do is we're going to think about a person who's born in this province and consider the lifetime expected utility of that person. Okay, so before the policy change, this is the number that the model spit out. It's captured pretty well that some places is very rich, like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, is very with very high present discounted value, and some locations that I'm not so sure whether it should be that way, but that's what the model think is like in the rural northeast western part. This also have very high welfare, but generally it looks like the model captures it very well. You can correlate that to the poverty incidence, and the correlation is around 0.4. So that's not too bad in terms of capturing the present discounted value of living in these places. What is the welfare effects? This huge heterogeneity. It's hard to say what it means. Let me put it in a bar plot. Okay, so there are 2 outcomes. This is the welfare change in terms of aggregate welfare. On the right is the changes in spatial Gini coefficient measured by the welfare measure, right? By the expected lifetime utility. So when you look at both policy, it's increased welfare in terms of aggregate by about 1.2%. This is actually quite a big number. And then when you think about like the effects of trade policy, for example. And in terms of spatial inequality, the changes is about 0.7% in terms of reducing spatial inequality in terms of household welfare. Okay, so that's the effects of the two policies. This is just policy evaluation. So how do we think about mechanisms? So let's split the policy one by one. What is the effects of the tax policy alone? Okay, the tax policy alone actually also increases welfare, perhaps due to increases in number of firms that creating more varieties. But the reduction in terms of inequality is not massive. It's actually quite modest. And the reason is because of the increase in the reduction in public services. The cost is actually quite substantial. But for the whole policy, it's both raising welfare because people are migrating to places that they would like to migrate to, and that creates productivity. At the same time, it's also reducing spatial inequality, right? Because based on the model and all of these estimates, it seems like it does help the places that outside of the A-star locations. Because in terms of present discounted value, now your option of migrating has now becoming much better. So the whole policy seems to be doing better at reducing spatial inequality than the tax policy. Okay, but is that the bottom line? No, right? If you think at this point that moving people is better than moving firms, I would challenge that. Why? Because now you can unpack the whole policy into two components. The component that reducing migration costs for the A-star places, and then the migration cost for only the non-A-star location. Remember, the policy have two components, right? So let's do the counterfactual with each of that component once at a time. So when you look at each component, you will see that easing migration barriers for people to the A-star locations is actually not good for spatial inequality. It does increase welfare a little bit, but it's actually hurting people because now it's making all these A-star places very productive, and it's leaving all these non-A-star places behind. Relative to that policy, if you're only reducing migration costs to the non-A-star locations, you're both gaining in terms of welfare and reduction in spatial inequality. In fact, that single policy of reducing migration cost to outside of the top 5 is actually more effective than the combination of both policies. Okay. So what's the takeaway is that the policy target or the design of the policy is more important than the types of policies. Okay. So how do we see? Okay. So the final point of the paper is that how do we think about substitutions versus complementary between these two policies? So one way to think about it is that you stack the tax policy with different components of the migration policies together. Okay. This is the sum of the two individual effects. But then this is the sum of the two. Is it the effect of the combined policy? No. The combined policy is what is in these bar plots here. So what you see is that the bar plots tend to be smaller than the ray box tend to be smaller than the sum of the two components. So what it means is that you exhibit some form of a substitution. Okay. Why is that? Because basically two policies is trying to do the same thing. They're trying to solve one problem, but doing it twice. And so making that two policy combination will be less effective. I mean, not less effective than each, but it's not going to be complementary, and it's going to exhibit some substitutions. All right. I'm happy to discuss more of this later. So I have 1 minute, so let me conclude. So this paper, what does it do? It's evaluate this policy package. It shows you why countries around the world do this kind of policies, because it seems to raise welfare and reduce some spatial inequality. But it has some costs, and that's not uncovered. It's not discovered before. I show that the combined policies demonstrates partial substitution in reducing spatial inequality because the package is smaller than the sum of the individual effects. And it's give you with an insight that perhaps the debate of moving firms versus moving people is not the right debate. Perhaps we should go back to thinking about how to design one policy very effective. In particular, I'm showing you that easing migration barriers to non-major city is twice as effective as the combined policy, whereas easing to only the top cities is actually doing more harm in terms of spatial inequality, despite gaining some welfare changes. So this paper is the first that's trying to bridge this place-based incentives and migration reforms literature. I provide a new model and some estimates to evaluate firm-based policies, as well as a general equilibrium study of large-scale migration policies, right? Similar to kind of Hukou policy with but this time we have firm dynamics and public service. And here I'm going to leave you with some policy implication of the paper. But that's essentially what I said earlier, which is the policy design is really important than the debate between moving firm versus people. Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope that I can engage more with you in the future.
Thanks a lot, Niam. I feel like every time I learn more about spatial policies in Vietnam, I just get more and more confused. But that's
Confused.
a good thing. The confusion comes before the enlightenment, perhaps. But yeah, so we have about 10 minutes or so for questions remaining in the seminar. So we'll just sort of open it up to the floor, and you can take them.
Yeah. Okay, please.
So I guess I can start. So I feel like maybe because I didn't read the paper, the model part. So for me, it's still I guess some clarifications would be helpful. So the first thing is I guess I still didn't see the because I asked about agglomeration at the beginning, right? And
Yeah.
when you explain the calibration and everything, I feel like that's to me still kind of missing. Uh, and so maybe you can explain whether you include that in your model. And the second question is, so for me, it's intuitive that when you reduce migration barriers, like relaxing hukou system, then resources can be allocated more efficiently, and that leads to welfare gains. But for the profit tax reform, to me, that's a bit. So is there anything is there inefficiencies in the model that the profit tax reform kind of help adjust? Like
Beautiful. I
yeah,
understand.
so
Yeah.
that's my question.
Yes, so two great questions, right? So the first question is about agglomeration. Yes, there is agglomeration in terms of like recruitment monopolistic competition thing. Is that if you move into urban places as the firms, you get benefits from trade costs because now you're closer to consumers, and that is in the model. Okay, but it's also have congestion forces with land which is fixed, which is a congestion force, and the government services is also a congestion force. So these two things are there, and the reason you actually see the effects of the A-star places kind of here, right? Where you see when you easing migration period for the A-star places, and inequality actually worsened is due to mostly agglomerations. Okay, so in that case, you do get the model telling you agglomeration is important. And the second question is about in what ways does the tax policy creating aggregate welfare gain, right? And in the model, it's actually coming from firm entries. So if you think about all these policies that in the US, that's true, like, oh, why do we have so much tax cuts? It's because they wanted to have firms, right? And it's showing in the model because now people get more varieties, right? They get more goods. It's like basically love for varieties. That's the way it's coming from. So it's been the race between the loss in public services, which is one goods that people care, versus the expansion in varieties that people also care. And then do they care where the goods come from? Not really, right? Because like the people, if you have more entrepreneurs in the B or C location, as long as trade cost is not so big, you get to consume that. Everybody in Vietnam benefits from having more varieties.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to get an intuition behind why the whole policy for the non-A star is much better than for the A star. Is it because in the model you embedded the congestion is more severe for the A star?
No. It's actually that's part of it. Okay. So are we talking about the welfare change or about the spatial reduction?
I think I want to ask both.
Both, okay. Yes. So for the welfare change, yes, it's because if you have too many people and too many firms in the A-star places, congestion started to kick in, and having this relaxation of the A-star locations really attract a lot of people to move there, and that seemed to kick into the congestion forces already. So that's for the welfare change. For the inequality part, the inequality part has two components. First is that there's a size, like there's only 5 A-star places. There's 55 non-A-star places. And so people can sort into places much better. So when you actually decompose this, when you look at the allocation of people in the non-A-star policy, you see that most people going to the A locations. So what are these places? Like A, what is it? It's like Banyu. So people don't go to like you because the cost is a little bit much higher now to go to Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. What they do is they would try to get to the second best cities. And for us, we don't know what the second best city for the people are. They can figure it out, and they go to like Banyu, they go to like right outside of the top cities, and that helped them, right? Because that reducing inequality without congesting this mega cities, and so that's why that's the reason why we see this reduction in inequality.
Thank you.
Yes, Brian.
Yeah, sorry, I have a number of questions. So before I do that, I will just thank everyone who attended. And I will be trying to book another one for August probably, and then also I've got plans for one in probably October. So thank you everyone again for participating. Feel free to hang around. Niam, do you have time or do you need like a hard
Yes,
finish
of
at
course.
12?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Let me start firing away with a bunch of questions. One, I am kind of wondering here about changes in transportation infrastructure during this time period and how that might be correlated with what you're attributing to as, reduction in, barriers to mobility. Maybe it's just a time cost thing, right? That it's a lot easier to get to and from places, and that makes it easier. So I'll start with that as the first question. Right, like Clarabelle both
that's a
AR
lovely
paper
question.
transportation during this time period.
This is really that's a great point, right? So what I'm trying, I would acknowledge that I don't think I'm going to be able to capture all of that changes in like roads and like player works, for example. The best way to do that is perhaps having her data in terms of the changes in transportations and include that in some way. But I would argue that I account for some of that already. So if you look at the left-hand side distribution here, you see that there's massive variation in terms of changes in migration costs. And the mean here, I mean, I attribute the mean to the changes in the whole code, but you could think of it as some of it is already captured by the dispersions of some of the changes in transportation costs already captured in the dispersion when you look at this distribution. So it's an assumption, right? Is it best? No. What about the spatial variations? Well, here we include both the destinations and origin fixed effects. So some of that, how good is it that now you can access the top city is already captured by the destination time fixed effects. In terms of the pairs, right? How good is it that the pair of moving between Bình Dương and Ho Chi Minh City, how good is that in terms of transportation cost? I've failed to capture the changes of that, but some of that is already captured in this origin and destination fixed effects thing. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I don't do any modeling, so I don't know how intensive it would be to try to, for example, bring in some of Clara's data.
Yeah, I tried. It's the replication package is a little bit difficult to digest at this stage. So, I mean, ideally, you would want to have like each pair of provinces, and then you can measure the travel cost, and you do the changes, and you include it in here. That would help with these spatial identifications.
Yeah. Okay. A second question I had going back to now sort of more on the firm angle, where you're talking about if I caught this correctly, that most of the positive welfare effects from firms is due to entrance. Is that right?
Yeah, for like it's not in terms of entrance, it's firms.
Oh, no.
The fact that now we have more firms in general, either
Just
due to more entrance or because they stay around a little bit longer.
Okay, I am just wondering, like if I think about informal firms who are endogenously choosing, do I stay informal versus do I formalize? And if there's been a big reduction in the corporate tax rate, right, all else equal, that makes formalizing a little bit more attractive, right? So
Yeah.
I'm wondering how much of this, when you say that, you have more firms in general, I wonder if it's just you have more firms who are being identified in your data set, right? In
Yeah,
the sense that they show up in the
absolutely.
enterprise data.
That's a beautiful like questions, right? And that's actually make me like pause. It took me a while to actually get to this stage of the paper because of this informal thing. So let's go back to the firm decisions here. So one way you can think of it is this model is actually failure at capturing the informal to formal transition, because in a way you should have another sector, which is the informal sector, where entrepreneur value in this informal sector, now they can stay or they can move into the formal things. So that's without data we cannot really tease out that flows. Now, what does that mean in terms of the model and the results? It's basically, I think this is going to be an underestimate of the effects of the tax policy, because this is purely showing the effects of changes in the number of firms that exist, um, without capturing the transitions of informal firms trying to jump into the formal sector because of the reduction in tax rate. So in a way, I'm not doing justice to the tax policy. Well, the, in other parts, I'm actually doing a lot more for the tax policy, and I'm happy to engage with that too. So I think on net, I don't think I'm going to underestimate too much of the tax policy.
Yeah, I agree that I don't think it's a first order issue, right? Like, some of the work I've done, some of the work that Eddie Molesky's done suggests that, formalization rates are not high. Right?
Mm-hmm.
The question would just in some sense be, does the formalization rate though end up being, correlated geographically, right? And, again,
Oh yeah,
I don't think it's going to be, I'd be surprised if somehow that, substantially overturns things very much, but it's just one thing that popped into my mind. If no one else has questions, I have lots more, but I don't want
yeah.
to
Let me
take
answer that. I think that's the reason why we exploit the variation at the location, age, and time, right? Because now we're just looking at within the established guys, how do they stay versus how do they exit. And in a way, I'm shining away from this, trying to remove, to take myself away from this danger of thinking too much about entry in identification, not in terms of the model.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, Let me sort of see. The other thing I was thinking about again in terms of sort of other spatial policies that are happening during this time period. Like I know Ang has
Yeah.
done work with like disadvantaged regions where households are given subsidies for like healthcare stuff like that. But then you also have like industrial zones proliferating all over the place. So I'm assuming that policies like that are basically being captured by the change in the relative value of a specific location. Is that
Yes.
right?
Absolutely. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. In the identification, let me be also very clear, because I really spend a lot of time thinking about that. Is that in this identification thing, right? In this strategy, I'm limiting myself into districts that is not part of special economic zones. So we observe where special economic zones are. I'm only limited to like the part of the district that have no zones, so that all of this like stay firms is actually only in places that non special economic zones. Uh,
Right. And everything here is conditional, like it's not on firm entry, right? You said like your estimation sample is based on firms who are already there and whether they
yes,
survive or not.
yeah, that's
Interesting.
right.
Okay. I definitely need more time to think about that like that. Because entry is massive overall, like at an aggregate level, entry is huge during this time period,
Yes.
right? And so if these tax code changes are influencing entry and you're not looking at that, I'm not sure how to think about that off the top of my
How
head.
do I? Absolutely, yes, exactly. That
Yeah.
that would be captured through the changes in the number of firms already, and that would capture in the value of these locations. The worry is that we need to identify this firm stay elasticity very well, and that's the focus of this part.
Okay. And then what
Brian,
about
just want to clarify one thing. So I think location B and location C in the paper is comparable to economic disadvantage and extremely disadvantaged. So like basically that is the policy, and maybe one of the policy you mentioned is the same policy.
and then like when your definition of the A star versus the A provinces, right? Like some of these are clearly neighboring, right? And we know that there's people who commute in from neighboring provinces into Hanoi, into Ho Chi Minh City, and
Yeah,
your firm level data is based on the location of the firm, but your migration data is based on the location of the individual, and these might not perfectly map. I've
yeah.
never seen anyone trying to create like commuting zone data in Vietnam. So like I don't have any, I just have anecdotal evidence, right, of just watching people commute in and out from the big cities, from neighboring provinces. How much do you think that matters for what you're doing here, right? Because you allow people to migrate between, right, and for firms to, but then they on a day-to-day basis they're not moving between provinces essentially, right?
No, yeah, I would believe that nobody moving between provinces on a day-to-day basis, like very rare.
Yeah.
That would be very, I mean, nowadays probably different, but like in the 2000s,
Yeah, no,
it's
I get
probably
like I'm
very,
just thinking about well, even back in the 2000s though, there was huge commuting, right? Going, workers, living outside of Ho Chi Minh City, commuting in, workers living outside of Hanoi, commuting in, right? So I guess I'm just wondering then about the firm location might be that okay, because of tax incentives, whatever, a firm's decision to stay in Ho Chi Minh City is different.
mm,
But then the workers don't actually necessarily move in the sense that they show up
ah,
in the census as being in Ho Chi Minh City. They might be in one of the neighboring provinces, right? And then they
yeah,
commute into Ho Chi Minh City on a daily basis.
mm,
I've never seen anyone trying to deal with that. I know I've done some very preliminary stuff where I have data that I probably shouldn't have in terms of where it tells me the name of the firm that a worker works in.
uh-huh,
And so then I was trying to like essentially just manually trying to match and figure, okay, well, where is that firm? Can I find that firm name in the enterprise data and say, okay,
yeah,
the same location? And definitely around the big cities, yeah, this was very small scale, but there's definitely, yeah, lots of people who are, living outside Hanoi and, commuting in and living outside Ho Chi Minh City,
wow,
commuting in.
yeah. I think
So
that would be a paper itself, right? Trying to create these commuting zones in Vietnam. I mean, this, especially trying to create it in a way that is consistent over the past 30 years or something. That would
yeah,
be
it
a
might
huge
just be like
endeavor.
one small caveat that you should at least in some point in your paper just
Mm,
mention, right? In terms of like your worker location data and the firm location data, it's not actually necessarily where the worker is working, right? It's just where they live.
yes.
Right. Well, okay. I'll be quiet now. I see lots of other people with questions.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, thank you for the paper. Quick question on following what Brian just said. Um, so so yeah, I do think that there's a lot of things to explore about the migration part between province, especially the whole ecosystem changed a lot between 2009 and 2019, I think. So I don't know, but what do you think about using microdata like for labor for from like DS or LFS or even the household survey? What do you think about that? Using that to
I agree
migration?
that there are lots of changes after 2009 as well. And so so like two things to say. I'm happy, very great, suggestions to think more about the changes in the whole policies post 2010. Uh,
Yes.
but that's a great project, right? And you can think of it like, changes in Hanoi in particular have very different changes in whole policy post 2010. Now, in the identification here, and I actually only exploring the migration flows between 2009 versus 1999. So I'm really trying to, all my identification is within this 10 years period, and trying to like not dealing with the things in the future. Well, how is that affecting the quantitative analysis? I would say it's not affecting much because really here the identifications trying to pin down the changes within this 10 years period. And the rest is just let the model speak for itself. But yeah, I do think that there's lots of papers can be written post 2010 using like different data sets, censuses and so on for later on. Yeah, it didn't.
Yeah, maybe you speak about this during the talk, but I missed it. But I want to understand more a bit how do people sort into different province in the model? because I assume that people will see a list of value of utility from each province, and how do you get those values or something like that?
Yeah. So where's that? I don't have the button to go here. Sorry. But yeah, so if you looked at the paper, basically the UI, right? Like look at the UI thing here. This is the value of being in location I. So let's say you're in Bình Dương. So the next period, what do you do? Either you stay in Bình Dương or you can choose to go to any other places. And the model assumes that you can observe all the fundamentals of the locations. So you know how much wages is paid in the rest of Vietnam. You comparing that wages, you comparing the prices of these places relative to your current locations. You're comparing the public services in those places relative to your locations. And you're comparing migration costs pair-wise to all the other locations. And then you have some idiosyncratic shocks. So for some reason you like one place over the other, and that's how you get your, and then you make your choice. You make your choice, and then the model would allow you to aggregate the choice into migration flows between any pair of locations.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't see any other questions, so maybe I'll stop the recording now, and